This Choircast podcast is brought to you by the book Drugs and Jesus by Josh Lawson. It's no secret that churches are stumbling in the dark when they look for ways to effectively serve people who use drugs. As the death toll of accidental drug overdose continues to rise across our country at an alarming rate, Christians are struggling to connect their faith with this urgent and holy work. Faith-based activists are attempting to bridge the gap, but so far, their message has been confined to socially progressive circles. Drugs and Jesus is the first book of its kind to pioneer a theological framework for people of faith, and especially evangelical Christians, to help them engage in the ministry of harm reduction. Drawing from my own groundbreaking efforts to equip faith communities at the epicenter of America's rural opioid crisis, Drugs and Jesus takes readers on a journey of theological and practical transformation that will help them learn how to better serve the most vulnerable members of their community, all without having to become experts in the field of addiction or theology. Drugs and Jesus releases from Choir Publishing on April the 11th. Don't miss it.
Western Christianity has spent the last 2,000 years telling everyone they're separated from God.
This is Not Church with Jon and Nat Turney.
All right. Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. My name is Nat Turney. I am here with my brother, Jon. Say, yo, what up, Jon?
Yo, what up, Jon?
Yeah, you missed a what up. There were two what ups in there. See, I was hoping because there was a severe lack of creativity on my part that you'd give me something to work with. And you know what? True to form, you did. I appreciate that.
I never failed to impress. I never failed to amuse. I never failed to fail. There we go.
Well, now that we have that out of the way, this is the podcast we have called This Is Not Church, because if it was church, what, Jon?
You would have left by now.
Amen. And you'd be right, and we'd be following you out the door. So it's all good. We're joined by another awesome guest in a long line of just awesome guests. I think we've been kind of killing it in the guest department. So everyone seems to be cool. So our next guest is a guy named Stephen Prothero. And I'm going to try and stumble through his bio. So if I mess it up, it's me, not, or my lack of reading glasses today. So I'm trying to read this. But Stephen Prothero is the C. Allen and Elizabeth B. Russell Professor of Religion in America in the Department of Religion at Boston University. He's the author of numerous books, including Religion Matters, An Introduction to the World's Religions, Why Liberals Win the Culture Wars, God is Not One, the 8 rival religions that run the world and why their differences matter, and the New York Times bestseller Religious Literacy, what every American needs to know and doesn't. Also, he has a new book coming out called God the Bestseller, which should be dropping here shortly. Hopefully by the time you hear this, it's out and available for you to snatch up and buy by the dozens and give as gifts. So keep the man working, right? His books have been published on 5 continents and translated into 8 languages. Prothero has commented on religion on hundreds of national public radio programs and on television on CNN, MSNBC, Fox, PBS, and all the major networks. He was also a guest on, and this is where you get me, dude. You were a guest on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. Yeah, you got me. The Colbert Report. I love Stephen Colbert. Who doesn't love Stephen Colbert? And the Oprah Winfrey Show. You hit the trifecta. I mean, that's amazing. A regular contributor to the Wall Street Journal and USA Today, he has written for the New York Times, Slate, Salon, and the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and the Boston Globe. If I threw the New York Times in there just because, it was there, wasn't it? Written for the New York Times, Slate, Salon, Washington Post. Okay. I've been working all day. My brain is sufficiently fried. I'll finish up here. Prothero was the chief academic advisor for the critically acclaimed 6-hour WGBH TV series God in America. He also worked as a senior fellow at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History and as a chief outside writer for CNN's Belief blog. He received his BA from Yale in American Studies and his PhD in the study of religion from Harvard. He lives on Cape Cod and he tweets at @SProthero. So that's a lot, man. I mean, Lord have mercy. I'm sure there's stuff that we left out of there, but amazing stuff. Welcome to the podcast, man.
Nice to be with you both.
When you hear it all kind of laid out like that, do you impress yourself?
I'm sufficiently impressed. Who is that guy? I don't know.
Oh, man, like that guy's freaking awesome. That's when I write my bio, it's about 4 sentences. It's got nothing to do with Stephen Colbert or Jonathan Stewart or any of that. Goodness. But anyway, so this new book that you've written, we're really anxious to talk about. But whatever else you want to talk about is great. But as we are at least a loosely affiliated faith-based podcast, we often like to kind of get an idea of our guests' religious background, maybe their trajectory through this thing we call faith. And if you're comfortable with that, maybe you could enlighten us a little bit.
Yeah, I was raised in the Episcopal Church. Churchgoers in my family throughout, my early adulthood, and had a brief time as an evangelical, I guess. In college, made my way out of that. And that was actually one reason that I ended up doing religious studies, because I was really interested as a kid, a teenager and a young adult, in big questions that religions pose. And I just found I couldn't really affirm or deny many of those. I couldn't give simple answers to those big questions like I felt I needed to be a participant in a religious community. And so that's kind of how I made my way into religious studies, as a way to keep asking those questions, look at them in different kinds of ways without feeling that I needed to come out one way or another on them.
That's one of those things that at least contributed to my exit from evangelicalism too, was a lot of hostility toward other world religions. I mean, and I guess it's part and parcel of anybody who's, fundamentalist in any particular religious sect. But that was my experience growing up. Was we didn't learn about other religions. We weren't encouraged to learn about other religions. In fact, we were oftentimes discouraged from doing any kind of reading outside of our own religious tradition. Was that kind of your experience too? Growing up in the Episcopal Church doesn't seem like it's that hard line.
Yeah, it wasn't that, but one of my exit ramps really was my friends in college. I had a friend who was a secular Muslim. I had Jewish friends, and I just felt inside the evangelical movement, sort of felt like I was pushed to try to be converting them, or try to be, telling them they were wrong and I was right. And I just finally found that to be not to work for me. So it really wasn't. I mean, there were kind of intellectual stuff that I was dealing with in college too. I was reading, Karl Marx, and I was reading, all sorts of stuff that challenged. I was reading, in religious studies, things that challenged what I was thinking. But it finally was more interpersonal. I kind of didn't like myself when I was trying to be a good evangelical.
Yeah, I find it interesting, and
I hear you.
I'm sure Naft's told stories of certain classes he took in college that kind of really pushed back on his faith. And for me, it was that was a time also. I took some classes on world religions. At one point, I thought I was going to major in anthropology with an emphasis on world religions. That's really what I thought, because I really found it very interesting. But it wasn't until college that I was allowed, because I'm a quote unquote adult, I get to make some choices on my own, and I get to take these classes that do kind of just open up a broader idea to these questions about faith and how they connect to people who don't look like me, who don't technically serve the same God. And this is also in quotes, because I think we might come to a disagreement on what that means on this quote unquote same God as we move forward with this book specifically, because I think there's a lot of questions in this book that talk about that, about what God we're talking about. So my first question about the book would be I don't know if it was the preface or the, was it a prologue that talks about this spiritual moment that Eugene had, right? Because this has got to be part of why because it comes up again and again and again in the book, right? About how he's always trying to find another connection to that spiritual moment, that for lack of better description, his Moses moment, right? His Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego moment, right?
Yeah, that's good. And I should have borrowed that.
But it feels like through his career with Harper and Brothers, which became Harper and Collins, and we can talk about that history later. But am I wrong in suggesting that maybe he was consistently and constantly looking for another version of that through these other authors?
Yeah, I think that's right. And this story of his his epiphany, you know, his encounter with God, his mystical moment, shows up, I don't know, half dozen to a dozen times in his archives, which I discovered and is the basis of this book, you know, thousands and thousands of letters and all sorts of his, you know, diaries and dream journals and, you know, his own drafts of speeches and things like that. And, you know, what happens is he's a teenager, he's 16 or 17 years old. He's put in a day on the farm. He's a rural Ohio kid. He's going to his fundamentalist Baptist church for Bible study with a bunch of church ladies by his own account, nobody his age. And he's riding his horse into town, and right in front of the graveyard, the horse stops and rears back and whinnies as if it's, you know, seen something. And he looks up, he sees this bright light, he feels this electricity running through his body. He feels himself being lifted up, and he looks and he sees God as he describes it. And he also feels that he will never doubt God again, which indicates, you know, he was a intellectually engaged enough kid that he had doubted God, you know, as a 16 or 17-year-old kid, even as he had faith in God at the same time. And then the way I interpret both his personal and his professional career is that he's just running around for the rest of his life, trying to meet people who have had similar experiences, have them tell their story to him, be able to brainstorm about, like, what the heck happened? Like, how do you make sense of this? Is there some way to recreate this? Are there techniques we can use, whether it's, you know, techniques of sitting in silence or gathering in, like, fellowship in small cell groups, as he called them, or some kind of Buddhist meditation strategies, whatever it might be, that can foster this experience, because he believes from that moment forward that what religion is about is not going to church. It's not going to that Bible study, but it's that thing that happened to him where he had a direct personal encounter with God, and he wants that to happen again, and he wants to write books that will help other people have that experience too.
Okay, now I want to even step back a little bit further and ask you a question. Was this like a planned event that you gained access to all of this information? I know you kind of I don't want to say you gloss over it, but you give it a basic information on how you were approached to look through his library. Was that what it was first?
Yeah.
And so at what point did you realize that there was even more to look through than just his library of books? You know, which you say, I think, like, most of them are inscribed to him by these great authors. As you know, you're starting to realize, okay, he wasn't only like an editor; he was very much friends with these people, and not that they would give him these personal notes when they write. But when did you realize there was even more to look through than just the books?
So I got a call from Eugene Exman's daughter, Judy, and she actually had cancer at the time, and she was trying to put together. She didn't tell me that, but I found out that later. She was kind of trying to put together her father's legacy, and what she thought of, the most present thing she thought of that legacy, was his book collection. And she knew that there were some amazing books in that collection, but I didn't know. She just called me and said, "Hey, can you come over? You're a religion professor. You live near me, 5 minutes away. Like, I know sort of your mom vaguely as an acquaintance. Can you come over to my house and look at my dad's books?" And I was like, "Okay, but like, why?" Like, I didn't say that to her, but I was
right.
And I was thinking, am I supposed to praise them? Am I supposed to, like, say they're cool? Do they want to give me some of the books? Like, what do they want? I had no idea. So by the time I got over there, she had actually passed away, and it was her husband, Walter Kess, who brought me into the library. And I was expecting these old, like, 19th century books and a bunch of Bibles and, like, hymnals and things like that, things that would be of no interest to any scholar or to any library or anything. And I was really surprised that they were mostly mid-20th century books. And so the very first book I picked up was Stride Toward Freedom by Martin Luther King. And I opened it up and I looked, and I looked whether it was first edition, which it was, which I thought was pretty cool. And then inside it, there was a letter from Coretta Scott King, and it said, "Dear Gene." And remember, I didn't even know the guy's name when I show up to look at the library. I don't know his first or his last name. So, "Dear Gene, thank you so much for coming down to Montgomery to convince Martin to write his first book. Thanks for all you've done for peace and brotherhood on behalf of the civil rights movement. Son of Coretta Scott King. And that's just sitting there inside the book. So then the next book, same like top shelf. These turned out to be like his top shelf books, like his best books. Right next to it was the Big Book of AA, which was published in 1939, 20 years before or so before King's Stride Toward Freedom. And I opened that up, and it's a large format book, as the name Big Book, would indicate. And there was pretty much an open early page that Bill Wilson, co-founder of AA, had written this long inscription. And it said, Dear Gene, thank you so much for looking at early chapters of the Big Book, for helping us find a printer, for agreeing not to publish it with Harper, because X-Men actually offered them a contract and then told them that they should keep it themselves because they were starting their own religious movement and they should control their own scripture. And I value our, lifelong friendship, signed Bill Wilson. And so immediately I'm thinking I had this task that I really hoped wasn't going to take very long. I had this amazing opportunity, and I went looking through all the books. And after I was seeing all these books with so much stuff inside them, right? Books by Aldous Huxley with letters from Huxley inside them. Books by Harry Emerson Fosdick, the most famous 20th century American preacher until Martin Luther King and Billy Graham. One of his books had 5 things inside it. Had like a Christmas card, had a postcard. It had a letter with some information about how many copies one of his books had sold. So then I finally said to Walter, I said, okay, the books are cool and interesting, but do you have any papers? Because, I'm a historian of religion. And so the books are interesting, but the papers inside them are more interesting than the books. And he sort of rolled his eyes back and he said, oh my gosh, this family, they never throw anything away. So I'm thinking, yes. Yeah, ding, ding, ding. So anyway, I went home. I had no idea who this guy was. I got his full name. I Googled him. I found out a teeny bit about him. I found a book by a scholar at University of Virginia named Matt Hedstrom. And he had written a chapter about X-Men. And I learned a lot about X-Men from that, about that he was a publisher. He was at Harper and Brothers from the 1928 to 1965, etc. But then I raced around online trying to find his papers, and I couldn't find him anywhere. And I got really excited about that because I thought, maybe he gave his papers to Columbia, maybe he gave his papers to his Denison College where he went as an undergrad, and he didn't. And so I got back in touch with Walter, and I said, I think the rest of his papers are in your house, and I think they're probably in the barn behind your house, which has a really nice roof because I've checked it. It doesn't look like it's got a lot of mice in it.
But it's got a roof, right? They're not all trashed.
It's got a nice roof. And so over the next couple of years, Walter would just call me up every couple of weeks, every month. Hey, I found another box. Hey, I found, a shipping, crate of letters. I mean, so much stuff. And I would go over there and I set up in his dining room and I went through the papers.
I mean, on the one hand, it's like, as a historian, it has to be just a treasure trove, right? I mean, but on the other hand, it's just overwhelming how much stuff is there. But
yeah, it was, I loved it because, I started my career and my training in archives. I was doing archival research as a historian of religion. And then once I got kind of mid-career, I started doing different kinds of books that really weren't archival based. So I just loved opening the boxes and having no idea what was going to be in there. Like, oh, here's a file that says Huxley, and this, 100 letters from Aldous Huxley in there that no one has ever seen, or here's a file called Trabuco, which was the name of a commune that he helped establish with Huxley and his friend Gerald Hurd out in Southern California that lasted for 8 or 9 years in the 40s. And there's all these records that don't exist anywhere else that he's kept that chart the beginning and the end and the demise of that commune in Southern California. It was kind of interfaith commune where the Christians from the East Coast, the Quakers and other Christians from the East Coast were coming west to learn from some Hindu swamis and some Buddhists about various meditation techniques.
And that in itself is interesting, right? Because this is obviously pre-hippie movement. This is pre-beatnik movement, right? So this is like the predecessor to the beatnik movement. And it's interesting that a lot of these movements happen on the West Coast, either like in the Bay Area or that Los Angeles area, right? These movements seem to kind of move to that area and then they kind of explode. But the question I would have out of all of this is, at what point, because like you said, he was raised as a Christian, believing in a Christian God, as far as I could assume. At what point did he, in his life, and that which he brought to Harper Brothers, was this idea to reach out to other faiths? Because it seems like throughout his career, he was never afraid to bring in authors of different faiths, and that would be one question. The second question is, how did he get away with it, especially in that era, where Christianity was like the only thing really going, right? If you were talking to anybody, it's like Christianity or nothing in this country. So one is why, and two is how the hell did he get away with it?
That's a really great question, and to answer it is really tricky because there's personal and professional things, and they intertwine. I mean, I think one really simple thing is, if you've had a mystical experience like he had, he didn't see Jesus. He didn't see the Virgin Mary. Like, he saw God. And if you want to do it again, if you want to have another experience, if you want to see God again, then it makes sense to talk to all kinds of people about how to do it, right? Instead of saying like, I saw the Baptist God right near my Baptist church. Let me go talk to some Baptists about how to see God again. No. I mean, you're going to get more information. You're going to get more strategies. You're going to get more advice. You're going to get more insight if you talk to Buddhists and Hindus as well as talking to Christians. So that's one piece. The other piece that's more professional is that when he got to Harper in 1928, religion publishing at the time was really denominational. It was Lutheran ministers publishing their sermons and selling them in Lutheran bookstores to Lutherans, right? It wasn't broader. So it was really Protestant denominational and then some Catholic book selling alongside it. And what his idea, which was a big idea and really important, I think, for the history of American religion, not just for American religion publishing, but his big idea was, let's sell religion books, not Baptist books, not even Christian books. Like, let's sell religion books. And we can get a preacher like Harry Emerson Fosdick, who's known as a liberal Protestant preacher, and he can write about what it is to be authentically human. And we can sell that book, not just to Baptists like Fosdick was raised, not just to non-denominational like liberal Protestants, but we can sell it to Jewish readers. We can sell it to Hindu readers. We can sell it to secular readers. And so there's that. There's the like, how did he get away with it? Because it was really profitable. That's the piece at Harper. It's really profitable. Your market is much broader if you're selling to every American who can read and who's interested in religion than if you're selling to Lutherans in a Lutheran bookstore.
That makes sense.
So that was one really important piece of it. But he himself kind of gradually loosens himself from his own perception as a Christian and as a Baptist. And he just starts to see himself as more of a seeker after God. And he believes in God. He never really doubts that. And he's just looking for ways to encounter God. And he just wants to publish people who are Zen Buddhists, publish people who are the Hindus that he met out west doing that commune experiment, publish Jewish authors like, Martin Buber and Abram Heschel, the civil rights pioneer, publish people like Dorothy Day, the founder of the Catholic Worker, and perhaps soon to be, official Catholic saint. So that worked for him both personally with his own curiosity, professionally because he was able to sell, books more broadly, and also it fit in and helped to propel the United States toward a more capacious, like pluralistic understanding of what religion is.
Yeah, from my perspective, that's a great contribution. Just the idea. I mean, you can say pluralistic, or in the Christian world, we'd even say like ecumenical, right? I mean, just even because even within Western Christianity, we're so narrowly focused a lot of times on our denominations. I remember getting involved with a group that was very ecumenical and having to explain a lot of times why I was hanging out with Catholics. And, you know, as a good non-denominational charismatic Christian, what was I doing hanging out with Lutherans and Presbyterians? I'm like, forget world religion. They're all talking about the same Jesus and they can't get along. So, yeah, and we need that, right?
And, you know, I don't know enough about your own story, but I think that, you know, non-denominational charismatic, like so much of the focus there is on experience, right?
Absolutely, 100%.
X-Men shared a similar thing. Like, if you think it's about experience, then why do you really care about the dogma and the doctrine and stuff? He would show up at retreats and he would run retreats. And I have records of these retreats and transcripts and things like that. And people would kind of naturally drift toward these like theological conversations, right? About, if it was more intra-Christian, it might be about the incarnation or about millennialism or something. And if it was more interfaith, it might be something about, is Jesus like the only incarnation of God, or there are multiple incarnations like the Hindus say? So Jesus is one among many. And X-Men would always do like time out,
like nobody cares.
Yeah. Stop it. Let's not do this. We're not here to do this. We're not here to argue about beliefs. We're here because we've all had these experiences of the divine. We share that together. Let's talk about that experiences. Isn't that what's important? And he's not doing it just for a kind of navel gazing, like he wants to have this cool feeling. He's doing it because he believes that once you have an encounter with God, you're totally transformed. And how are you transformed? You're transformed into someone that's going to try to fix this totally messed up world in which we live. And the world he's living in is a world that has survived World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II. This was not an easy, like his life starting in 1900, he's doing just fine until he's like 15, 16 years old.
Yeah, and then it all goes to hell, right?
Getting ready, he's in the army, right? And the backdrop of this is this, you know, Christian and Western ebullience about progress and all this stuff. And that's just all shot to whatever. I don't know if I could say it on your podcast, but
you can say shot to hell, shot to shit, whatever. It don't matter.
Exactly. So it's done that. And he thinks that what we need is what people need to see something that's true and real and powerful other than materialism, other than the military. And for him, that's God. You see the reality of God, you're going to be drawn away from, you know, consumerism, from materialism, and from militarism and war. And almost all the people he published were mystics, and almost all of them were also pacifists. They combine that activism, political sense, passion for justice with mysticism, without doing mystical withdrawal. It's a really interesting crew.
Well, then I would think he'd be horrified to see how far the Western Evangelical Church has slipped into materialism, consumerism, militarism, nationalism. I mean, all those things that he would say were probably hallmarks of people who were antichrist. Like, you have not been really, this sort of, forgive my no true Scotsman fallacy, but you have not truly been transformed. If these are still the things that you're pursuing, you couldn't have actually met the divine if the outcome is, now I really have to pursue more nationalism. I really have to marginalize people more. That to me is what is tearing apart the evangelical church right now, is that disconnect between, you know, a mystical experience that transforms and one that just leaves you to pursue your own interests.
Yeah, and it's also, you know, what's the cart and what's the horse, right? Like, is it politics? Are you really ultimately, in your heart of hearts, you know, a Christian nationalist who wants to, you know, make the U.S., you know, a white country? Or are you, in your heart of hearts, a Christian who's like trying to figure out what God, you know, wants for your life and wants for the life of your community and the life of your country? And I think, you know, he was an intellectual. He had a lot of humility about what he knew. You know, he had what we call in academia epistemic humility. Like, instead of just thinking he knew everything, you know, he had some humility about things. He thought, he was convinced God knew more than him. Imagine that. Imagine a person knowing that God knows more than they do. But he was on that. He was on that team, and that's part of why he was always wanting to talk to other people, because he thought he might learn something. He might learn something from it.
In reading his papers and his letters, do you get a sense of when he Was he always a pacifist? Was he always someone that kind of leaned that way, or was it maybe after World War I? Was it from that spiritual experience, or where did he start aligning with that group of people, or that culture, or that identity?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't fully track it down in the book. I tried, but I couldn't quite date it because I don't have him in a letter saying when it happened, but it happened in the 20s. He was in the sort of precursor to ROTC, the college, military program. That's how he was able to go to college. They didn't have any money in his family, and he was able to go. He was able to get a uniform. He was able to get a small stipend, and his tuition was paid for. That's how he was able to go to Denison College. But the war ended pretty early on in his first year of college, and so he was not a pacifist then. He entered into conversation there with liberal Protestants whom he really hadn't known, and the friends of his in college who went to seminary, they went basically to more liberal Protestant seminaries rather than to more conservative places. And so they were probably, at least talking about pacifism there. And then he was certainly influenced by people like Harry Emerson Fosdick, who was a pacifist in the late 20s. But I think by the time he went to New York in 1928, I think he was already a pacifist then. And I don't know much more about it except for that he was among the people in World War II who remained pacifists, which was very difficult in World War II and difficult after revelations about the Holocaust. But he was just convinced that materialism and militarism were the two great cancers on the modern West and the world, and he was just going to fight them both for his whole life.
Well, it definitely then he uses that as he reaches out to people that he wants to connect with to help edit books and have them published by Harper Brothers, right? I mean, it's definitely, it's pretty obvious the group of people that he reached out to that were part of that intellectual group already, or already outspoken in that group, right?
That's right. And so they tended to be pacifists. They tended to be mystics. They tended to be liberals in the sense, and they tend to be interfaith. And by liberals, I mean like liberal theologically. And they tended to be interfaith and open to learning from other religions. They also tended to be perennialists who believed all the religions were the same. Fosdick is an interesting counterexample because Fosdick, I wrote a whole book called God Is Not One against the perennialism idea, the idea that all religions are different paths up the same mountain. There really isn't any essential difference across religions. I don't believe that. I think religions are very different from one another as a rule. And it was interesting that Fosdick pushed back against Exman's perennialism by saying, look, I mean, Buddhists just don't believe the things that Christians believe. They don't value necessarily the things that Christians value. And they're different religions. There's nothing wrong with being a Buddhist, but just don't pretend that it's the same as Christianity. But most of his people, a lot of the people he published, he published Huxley's Perennial Philosophy in the mid-40s, which is, sort of the classic primer of perennialism. He published Houston Smith's book, The Religions of Man, which was later reissued as The World's Religions. It sold 3.5 million copies in world religions classes across the world and across the United States since the 50s. It's the most widely read book in religious studies that I know of. And it makes the argument that religions are essentially the same. That was another shared feature. But often the people would have, 3 or 4 of those features rather than all of those features. But he was definitely drawn to them. And the books that he published go out into the world at a time when books really mattered and when books weren't in competition with television, when books weren't in competition with the internet, and when books could really have a huge influence on people's lives and on a culture. And I think that's part of the way he had such a big influence was the timing of.
Well, and it's also interesting. Yeah, I don't want to give away everything in the book, right? I want people to buy this book. And what I said prior to us starting recording, which I told you I hate this book, and the reason I hate this book is, and anyone It's a joke. I highly recommend this book. It's an awesome.
Tongue in cheek.
Put that on the paperback. Can we put that on the paperback? I hate this book.
I hate this book. John Journey. This guy nobody knows.
The reason is there are so many endorsements. Oh yeah, I'll definitely do that. There are so many stories in this book that make me want to now go find books by these other people. I mean, most of us, I think, know who Huxley is.
I'll admit, that's the first time I've heard Fosdick's name.
Yeah, I didn't know who Fosdick was.
I'm embarrassed by that. Huxley, I know. It was this Martin Luther King guy again? See, someone important? I'm just kidding.
Howard Thurman is in the book too. He's a friend of King.
Yes,
he's a generation older than King. He goes to college with King's father, and he publishes over a dozen books with X-Men. And how does X-Men get him on his list? He goes and meets him. He does the same thing as what he did with Martin Luther King. He just tracks him down in the 30s. And then they stay friends throughout the 30s. He doesn't publish a book by him until 10 years later by Howard Thurman. And then Howard Thurman ends up at Boston University, where I teach now. He was a chaplain there. He founds an interfaith church in San Francisco. X-Men publishes a book about that. And he also has a mystical experience when he's traveling in India. And he gets this sense that God wants him to establish this interracial and interfaith church. And so, yeah, he's another one of those folks in the book.
The one that I find interesting, because she shows up pretty much through this whole book. There's a chapter specifically about her, but she seems to pop up throughout the book, and that's I believe it's Marguerite, right? Marguerite Bro. But there is a chapter about her, but then I feel like she's present through this whole book as almost like his, I don't want to say his conscience, but almost as like his intellectual sounding board. Someone who was there to say, you're not pushing hard enough, or you're pushing too hard. And for those, there's a shocking element of, was their relationship a little closer than we thought, or that I find interesting. Not as interesting as the overlying version of the story of the book, but of course there's that moment, right? A male and a female can't be that intellectually close or that personally close without us questioning, well, how strong was that relationship, right? I mean, it's almost like built in. It becomes that question, right?
Yeah, when I gave the first paper I gave about this to some academic friends of mine was about the two of them and their relationship and her contributions to his book list, and a couple people there, they said, just write a book about her. She's amazing, and she's amazing. I think there's over 1,000 letters from her in the archives. So you just have this really, really rich record of her. She was a novelist. One of her novels, published, I think, maybe in the 30s, maybe in the 40s, is still in print. She published nonfiction books. She published a widely acclaimed book about Indonesia because she had lived there. She had been a missionary in China when she was young. She traveled fairly widely in Asia. She published a bunch of ghostwritten books for X-Men and a few for other people. Dozens of books she wrote under other people's names. She was a contributor, longtime contributor to Christianity Today. No, sorry, not Christianity Today. Christian Century. That's the liberal Protestant one instead of the evangelical one. Christian Century. She was a Disciples of Christ minister. She is a beautiful writer. Her letters are funny. Her letters are self-deprecating. Her letters are smart. She has a kind of nature mysticism about her in her letters, where she's always writing about the natural world around her. And she's also giving voice to this tension of a smart, savvy woman in the 40s, 50s, and 60s who just has so many barriers to be heard and so many barriers to making money, and yet plays a really, really important role in the success of X-Men's career and in the kind of contributions to American religion that X-Men made. Those were all very much at least a third or a half or a quarter or whatever it was, hers. She was a huge contributor to all that stuff.
Was she ever literally on the payroll for Harper, or was she always just working for X-Men as this kind of like back behind closed doors editor for him?
Yeah. So she's doing that editing work as a freelancer mostly. She was Exman's choice to do Martin Luther King's first book, but she was too busy with other stuff. And so that ended up going to someone else, but he actually asked her to do that. But she was on the payroll for some periods. And I'm not sure the exact total amount of time that she was, in the Harper offices on the payroll, but she was mostly a freelancer. And she was amazing with authors. I mean, I have a lot of the letters to her authors, and she would really push back at them. She would say, come on, you've only given me 4 sentences of your autobiography. Can you give me a little more information? I need something to work with here, And she'd have interesting conversations with, Exman about various books. And so, yeah, she's a really wonderful and important character in the book.
Well, I would concur with whoever's telling you that should be your next book, is talking about writing about her, because specifically because of the struggles and the hardships that women had in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, as coming up in a very male-driven, very patriarchal business model, right? Where women are, women could, like, within that era, women could be a secretary, or maybe the one who goes and gathers information for you, but they couldn't be editors. That would be beyond that, right? So I would concur that would be an interesting. I would love to read that book.
Yeah, there's a really poignant moment when Exman's secondhand man dies. This guy named John Chambers. He's really close to Bro, and he's really close to Exman. And he dies of a heart attack very young. And Exman's doing a search for his replacement, and he asks Bro about it. And she writes a letter to him, and she says something like, of course, I don't have like the right genitals to have this job, like she really very explicitly kind of says, you should hire me. Like, I'm the one who does all this work. Like, I'm the one who's I'm more your your right hand man in this than John was, but he doesn't even contemplate hiring her. And there's other times when she's writing and she's asking for more money, and the amount of money she's asking for is really small. And it's just weird how they can be such close friends, and yet Exman at certain points is saying, yeah, we can't pay you more than $5 an hour or whatever it was. But then her son or her daughter needs some help, and Exman like bends over backwards and helps them get jobs. You know what I mean? Like, he's really extending himself, but there's certain places where he just can't go when it comes to the publishing establishment.
I got one more area that we can't not talk about. And that is this connection between, I'm sorry, I want to make sure I get his name right. Because again, I know all about AA. I knew about the AA book, but I never knew who was like the main contributor. I didn't. So Bill Wilson. So this we got to talk about this. Bill Wilson and Eugene taking LSD.
Wait a minute. Hold up.
Yeah. So
yeah. Need to hear that.
This is where, John, we need to go back to something you said earlier about, this is before the counterculture. This is before the 60s.
Right. Yes.
Exman goes to India to get a guru like 4 or 5, 6 years before the Beatles go. He does LSD in 1958, 4 years before Timothy Leary does LSD. And when he's doing LSD, he's doing it with a bunch of nerds. Like, he's not doing it with cool countercultural people. They're not beatniks. They're not hippies. They're like spiritual experimenters, who have like read too much, like read too many books, and they're just trying to find a shortcut to God. And there's some research that even at the time, people are doing research on LSD. This is not like something that's handed around, in college dorm rooms yet. This is research that they did with a doctor, with a nurse in their presence, with specifically designed, microgram amounts of LSD, with a protocol where you write a report 24 hours after your trip where someone is watching you the whole time and making notes about what you say and how you look and what you're doing. Are you going outside, inside? Are you dancing? Are you crying? Like, what's happening? So yes. And so it's weird enough that X-Men's doing it, but then Bill Wilson, like the anti-addict, right? The guy who's trying to get people to get off alcohol so they can have, productive lives. But why is he interested? He's interested for two reasons. He thinks it's a shortcut to God, but he also thinks you have to have an experience of God in order to get off drinking. That's what happened to him. He had two mystical experiences, and he credits those with him being able to give up his pride, give up his, I can conquer alcohol on my own. No, I can't do that. God taught me that. And he believes that's the only way to do it. Like, he's kind of a little bit of a fundamentalist. He doesn't think, there's 10 different ways to stop being a drunk. He's like, no, you got to have the God thing. And so he believed that if you had an LSD trip, there was a good chance you would have, and like him, you would see God in that trip, because he did in his, at least one of the trips he did with X-Men's group. He claimed that it was like a precursor of his mystical experience before. So, but then finally, it just gets too dicey. Like, the word gets around inside AA. Like, Bill Wilson is dropping acid. And so he stops, I think about 1960. He stops.
And who was it who says they saw Lucifer? Was that X-Men, or was that
X-Men? So X-Men has two trips. And this is the amazing thing about the archive I found. So I find these reel-to-reel tapes, and I look at them, and some of it's classical music and stuff, but one of them on the cover, it says LSD.
Oh no!
And so you play the reel-to-reel tape. It's an audio tape of his trip.
Oh my God!
And then very late in the book, like very shortly before I turned it in, I called up Walter and I said, Walter, there's this confusion about the tapes, because X-Men had two trips. And, one of the tapes got sent by this woman at this time to your house after X-Men died. And I just think you have another tape. Like, can you look around and see? And he calls me like 2 days later. He's like, yeah, I do. I have another one. So I was able to get both. The second experience, he has a spiritual experience, but is not of God. And he says he saw Lucifer. And so that's when he stops. And that's when he stops believing that this is he thinks it opens you up to all kinds of supernatural influences. And because there are both divine and anti-divine influences in the world, that there can be kind of equal play on you. And it's really not worth the risk, at least for him.
Well, I mean, that makes sense. I mean, you open yourself up, and who knows? I mean, I've never dabbled with the LSD, John. Although I've been tempted, but I don't know. I'm not sure. Maybe that's part of me. I was like, I'm not sure what. I think you would attract. I think you'd open yourself to what you might attract. In which case, for me, it would be demons and bad shit. But that's interesting. I mean, I've always kind of been interested in Bill Wilson and his whole approach to, what becomes Alcoholics Anonymous and obviously by extension, Narcotics Anonymous and all the other 12-step programs. And to find out that this man had a hand in helping get that work started and published is, well, a legacy. I mean, he's got his hands in civil rights. He's got his hands in substance abuse. He's got his hands in all kinds. I mean, that's for a guy that probably most people have never heard of, and whose name would not be super familiar. That's what a legacy. And I admittedly, I told y'all before we started, I left my copy of this book at home. So if this is a dumb question, because it's in the book, but was he friends with Thomas Merton? Did he know Thomas Merton? I know that he did publish with HarperCollins. And John's laughing like, holy shit, there's a whole chapter on Thomas Merton, but I don't know, maybe not.
I think, no, he didn't publish Merton, even though Merton published with Harper, but Merton's book, I think, was in the trade division.
Yeah, I think he was a big enough name by then, right, that he maybe not have been sort of pigeonholed into the religion. I don't know. I'm just a huge Merton fan, so any stories about Merton would be great.
Yeah. So Merton is friendly with Dorothy Day, whom he does publish. And there's some conversation between, and X-Men certainly knows and reads Seven Story Mountain by Thomas Merton.
Yeah, which is, yeah.
And
I think that's the part that's in the book. I think it probably.
Well, I'm thinking because that's such a sort of mystical experience. That was Merton's whole shtick, right?
It is right up Exman's alley because one thing that it's funny how when you write a book, like things they come to you in drips and drabs, and it was toward the very end that it came to me that he's publishing all these biographies and autobiographies. Why is he doing that? Well, he's doing that because he believes that religion is about experience, about personal experience. And how do you write about personal experience? Like in a memoir, like in what we now call a memoir, but was then called an autobiography. And so that was just right up his alley, pacifist, mystic, even Catholic, by that time he was publishing Catholics like Dorothy Day. He was Exman published these inexpensive hardcovers of medieval Catholic mystics. He wanted people to read them, and they were in public domain, so he didn't have to pay the author. And he was publishing them. So yeah, I don't know why he didn't get Merton. I think Merton was just approached by someone else, and so it didn't go Exman's way.
Nah, just curious because I like as you're describing sort of his philosophy, and I'm like, man, that's just Merton. I would just keeps hitting those. It keeps checking those boxes off, and like you said, mystic, political activist, pacifist, all those things. It would check all his boxes off. But yeah, and I know he was friendly with Doris Day and
Dorothy Day.
Dorothy Day, not Doris Day. Doris Day was the actress.
I think Merton blurbs one of her books. I think he might blurb The Long Loneliness, which is now regarded as kind of classic in American Catholic literature.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Like I've said earlier, I didn't know who Eugene Exman was when I started reading this book. So I had to do my own research. So I Google him and I want to see what he looks like. So I get pictures of him. And this is going to be a weird connection, but just go with me for a second. He's such the quintessential middle-aged white, I wear a suit, I wear a tie guy, right? That you automatically assume that this can't really work. The reason I can buy into it is a quote from Frank Zappa. So Frank Zappa talks about the early music industry and why they were allowed to do such crazy shit. And it's because these old middle-aged white guys went, oh, what the hell? Give it a shot. I don't know. Maybe it'll work. Maybe it won't. I don't know. It wasn't until later that these young and upcoming like hipster guys took over the music scene that they kind of, they fucked it all up. And I kind of feel like that's Eugene is like, just give it a shot. Let's see what happens.
The photo you probably saw is this like canned studio shot that is him like right in the middle of his career. He's probably like, 50, 52 or something like that. Yeah. He's got these like classic glasses from,
he's kind of holding them, but
he's got the suit. He's kind of
one.
There you go. Yeah. So the one on the right with the glasses. Yeah. He's kind of like
that's the guy. Yeah. That's the dude.
Yeah. He's thoughtful, and it's interesting, when he has his first trip, he is obsessing about his body. And it's really, really fascinating because I think he was 5'6", 5'7". He wasn't tall. He wasn't particularly good looking guy. He wasn't unattractive. I think he was kind of, plain looking. You like he's a 5 out of 10 or something, if you're going to do that thing. And, in his trip, he talks about, I've never felt comfortable with my body. I always wish my body was better. I always wish I was more attractive, and he's struggling with this whole thing. And because he's disassociating from his body, right? He's kind of coming out of his body in his trip, right? So he's sort of looking back at it and seeing it and kind of meta thinking about the whole thing. So it's one time when you get in his biography of his like sense of, that he wasn't like Bill Wilson was a handsome, charismatic guy, and Exman was kind of quietly charismatic. He was able to gather people around him, but he sort of gathered people around him that became a group rather than that became a bunch of people like gawking at him. If that makes sense, right? He didn't have like Bill Clinton charisma like Bill Wilson had. he had a different kind of social power.
So you could maybe liken it to like Tolkien and Lewis and their group of, the Inklings, right? I wouldn't consider Tolkien or Lewis someone who's like, they're not striking. They are rather average, but just through their charisma and their ability to bring people around them that want to communicate and talk about very similar topics. So they can create this world of like-mindedness, I guess.
Yeah, and X-Men tried to get C.S. Lewis, by the way.
Did
he? He was the backup for, I forget which early C.S. Lewis book, but I think C.S. Lewis ends up publishing maybe with Doubleday in the United States.
That would have been interesting.
But X-Men tried. X-Men wrote to him and reached out. He said, I've read, your books that are being published in England. We want to publish you here. And he didn't get him. But at some point along the line, Harper One, which is the follow-up to X-Men's religious book department, did acquire the Lewis estate books, and those are all published now by Harper One.
Yeah, I mean, at the time, Lewis was a pretty big name. I mean, he still is, obviously. He's still one of those guys that, if you're not religious at all, you still know, oh yeah, okay, that guy I know.
And his books keep selling. They keep selling and selling and selling. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's something to him, that's timeless, I guess. But of course they keep making movies too, so that doesn't hurt. But yeah, I'm fascinated, John. I'm just, me, I'm a big history buff. And so I would have probably just loved to pour through those archives with you and just be like, man, letters from Martin Luther King. I mean, letters from Aldous Huxley. I mean, good. Oh man, it would have been like a dream. Actually, what I was going to mention too is John and I, for a long time, we just like books. I mean, we're just book nerds, And so when you described going to his library and like first thing you did was look to see if it was first edition, that's exactly what I would have done. I'm like, all right, flip. I might have skipped past the inscription on the other page. Yeah, that's very, very cool, man.
Well, okay. One more story, and then I know we're getting close to the end of our time. And this, again, I'm gonna put this to pop culture. I think this is because I just recently watched Medicine Man with Sean Connery. So he's in someplace in Africa, right? Trying to find the cure to cancer. And then you start describing how they are heading to Africa to meet up with Albert Schweitzer. And all I can envision is it, I can't remember, Lorraine Bracco, is that the female that meets up with Sean Connery's character, and she's on that canoe and she's somewhere in Africa and she doesn't know where she is anymore. And she's on this last part of the journey to find him. And so that's what I envision as Eugene's trying to find Schweitzer, is he's in the middle of some African jungle, kind of climbing through the forest into this like village that Albert Schweitzer is running like a hospital. Is that what it was?
Yeah, that's right. And, this is again where X-Men just keeps being ahead of his time. He's kind of like a Forrest Gump or like Zelig figure. It's like, oh, here's Albert Schweitzer. Oh, there's, Eugene photobombing him like from behind. And, Schweitzer comes later to the United States and he becomes famous. And then he wins the Nobel Peace Prize in 1952. But X-Men was publishing him in the mid-40s, like before he was really known in the United States. He was widely known in Europe. And the kind of myth of Schweitzer as the scholar, the writing about the historical Jesus, being the greatest organist of his time in Europe, or at least one of them, and then giving it all up to go to medical school and leave and go to Africa. This was before skepticism about like white savior mythology and do-gooder missiology and all that kind of stuff. It was really widely hailed, like very widely written up in places like Time and Life, as like the greatest man in the world. And so X-Men, before all that publicity, X-Men was onto him and he was corresponding with him. And in the archives is a bunch of Schweitzer, letters, written in French, which is the language. He lived right on the border of like what is now France and Germany. He had both those languages, but X-Men goes and he sees him and he writes about him and he becomes kind of obsessed with him, so much so that one of his friends says, have you become like Schweitzer's agent in America? Like, are you just trying to publicize the guy? Because he was writing about him. He was publishing his books. He was raising money to send back to Schweitzer's hospital that he was running to, help local people with medical care. So yeah, that's another chapter in the book, his engagement with Schweitzer.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm kind of shooting blind here, but I think currently John Dominic Crossan publishes with HarperCollins, right? Or is that right, John? Harper One?
Harper One, I think, yeah.
Harper One. So, and he was one who John mentioned early on. I circle back because we mentioned things we studied in college that kind of began to open our minds a little bit. And one of the things that I, as a young burgeoning, evangelical 20-something in college, I took a class on the historical Jesus, thinking it would be a great primer on, be it like a religion. I'm like, oh, this is great. I'm learning about Jesus. And the assigned reading was Crossan. And I remember, we had Dom on the podcast a while back. And I remember telling him, I read your book and I hated you because you just challenged every assumption. You messed with all my theology. And, it took about 20 years to come back around and go, oh no, he was really ahead of his time with that. It piqued my memory because you mentioned the historical Jesus stuff of Schweitzer and others. And just, again, the legacy of that division of Harper that continues to push the edge, I think is something worth noting, man. So awesome.
Schweitzer's main shtick on Jesus was just that we just don't, everybody's freelancing, like everybody's making shit up. And we just don't know. We just don't know about all these big questions. And that was it. Like it was really important for a scholar to say that yeah, we have actually more about Jesus, more information about this guy than we do about almost any, figure of an ancient figure. But
right. But it's still not much.
Even so, we just can't answer all these questions that we want to answer, given the source material and all this kind of stuff. And basically, if you look at historical Jesus scholars, Schweitzer says, they're looking down in a well to find the historical Jesus, and what they're seeing is themselves. That's what scholarship.
Wow, that's a good quote. I'm sure Dom would agree. I'm sure anyone who's engaged in that work must at some point come to that conclusion. Like, okay, like you said, I remember seeing that class and the professor being pretty antagonistic, and I think there was a purpose to his antagonism, but basically positing that there are those among us who believe that just the actual even existence of Jesus is questionable, and it's a small class. We were taking a summer session. There might have been 15 or 20 kids in the class, and about 16 of us went, like that's what you're going to burn in hell for saying that. You can't just, and lo and behold, I mean, there are now, I think, as you say, as far as historical figures go, he's pretty well established as having at least existed. But there's still not that much. I mean, especially if you're someone like Dom or someone like Schweitzer who might say, well, we can't necessarily just accept the biblical canon. We got to go extra biblical. And once you do that, you start to find some either contradictions or and that was the whole, the Jesus Seminar's whole point was, how much of this that we've attributed to Jesus having said, can we actually corroborate, and how much is tradition and how much is folklore and mythology. But anyway, it does have a tendency to take a young evangelical and kind of break him a little bit. Kind of go, you either run screaming back to your church, or you go, this deserves some investigation, right? John, you had something to say, man. I cut you off.
No, I don't have anything else to say other than everyone who's listening, buy the book. Buy the book.
It all?
You will not be disappointed. Yeah.
If you buy the book, you should read the book, because I currently have the book and it's sitting on my nightstand.
It's not a small book. I don't, minus the notes and all that. It's probably about 300 pages or so, right? But I sat down and I couldn't stop reading. I read it all in one sitting. I mean, wow.
That's pretty good for a book you hate. I like
Jeez, I'm gonna have to.
Hey, the last book I did that with was the one about Henry Nouwen.
Oh, yeah.
Kevin Brown's book. I couldn't stop reading that. That was so I love books like that. I'm sure yours will be the same. I'll probably just start and be like, crap, I can't stop now.
It's a really good book. You'll be hearing stories about people that you know and people you don't know. And then I think like me, you'll then be looking up these people you don't know and trying to find their books because you want to add them to your reading list. And I think, specifically a biography type or a memoir type book or, definitely if that's what they do, then they've done their job. They've definitely opened you up to some new ideas.
Yeah, for sure.
And some interesting characters, which are real people, which is just awesome. And, I'm not kidding. I have, I think 5 or 6 books already written down on my to read list from just reading this book. So thank you for that. And, yes. And please, everybody, I was joking when I said I hate this book. I love this book.
Yeah. Stephen, thank you so much, man. We appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Nat and John. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to This Is Not Church. Be sure to rate and review the podcast on your platform of choice. If you would like to partner with us, visit patreon.com/thisisnotchurch, where you will receive exclusive content such as early access to episodes, videos of upcoming episodes, and live Q&A sessions. Be sure to check out our Facebook group or follow us on Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode.